Good morning, everyone. Welcome as you're joining our Zoom webinar this morning. We are in week 3 now of our Coping with COVID-19 Creative Solutions for Your Business webinar series. My name is Patrick Luensmann, Senior Program Manager at the Center for Business Growth and Innovation at the University of Northern Iowa. We want to thank you for joining us this morning. As everyone's still kind of loading in here, we appreciate you taking the time to come and be with us today. If you're watching live in Zoom, this is interactive. So if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer them if we can. And if not, or if it's too specific, we'll follow up with you after the session today to make sure you're getting the resources that you need. And if you're joining us live on Facebook, do feel free to comment your questions there, and one of our staff will make sure that they get back up here to our presenters. So joining me this morning is the SBDC Director from the UNI region, Amy Dutton, coworker, colleague, and friend of mine. And today we're going to be talking about the PPP application. So as many people have probably seen and heard, out of the CARES Act, we've got the Paycheck Protection Program. And we're going to try and take a few minutes this morning. This session's going to be a little bit shorter than normal. Try and be brief and to the point and really get into showing you the application and the things you need to do to be able to get it filled out, filed, and hopefully approved and back to you. So Amy, thank you for being here with us this morning.
You bet. Thank you, Patrick. So yes, as Patrick said, this morning we're going to talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, and whoever came up with that name never had to say it 10 times fast, but that's why we call it the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. This is currently funded at $349 billion in forgivable loans. And so today we're not going to be talking about specifics of how the loans are funded or approved or uses so much, but we're really going to be focusing more on the application process, simply to go through the form and help you understand what's expected there. I do want to go through some just broad strokes about the loan, just so you understand, get kind of the ground rules. It is forgivable, and there's certain things you can use it for, and this will tie back to the application. So payroll, you can use it for most mortgage interest, rent, utility costs, and that's all for the 8-week period after the loan is made. And that's really tied to that forgivable piece. There is a cap on how much payroll per employee. That's $100,000 per employee. And then it is important to remember that when you're applying for this, and we're going to get into the details of the application, that no more than 25% of what's forgiven can be used for non-payroll. So as you're filling this out and you're signing the attestations and you're initialing and saying, yes, I understand and believe this to be true, remember that there is that rule there. This is something you apply for through a bank. So we're hearing SBA associated with this, but you don't apply directly with the SBA. This you do with your regular bank. So you first want to talk to your banker, see if they're participating in the program, and find out if they're involved in the PPP program. They may not be. I know most banks are trying to get into the system and do this, but do have that conversation. If you end up going with another lender, we just encourage folks to make sure you keep that dialogue open with your present lender so they know you're working on the PPP program. We'll talk a little bit about who can apply as we go through the application, and you are going to have some documentation you need to provide when you're going through and working with your lender. There are lots of ins and outs on this, and we're hearing a lot of questions, and I just need to say that the Small Business Development Center, if you're not familiar, we're an entity that provides no-cost confidential business counseling to small businesses. So many times that takes the form of a startup or somebody who's looking to expand. And right now we're wearing a little different hat as we try to help people as we go through this really unusual situation we're in, and hopefully get into recovery here before too long. So right now we're helping people to understand what this process looks like. This loan is at a 1% fixed rate. The term is 2 years on the portion that is not forgiven, and all payments are deferred for 6 months. So if you're able to have the whole amount you apply for forgiven, great. If not, you do have 2 years to pay that off, and you have 6 months of deferred time on that. There's no prepayment penalties or fees. So if you do get this as a loan that you don't end up getting forgiven, you can pay that off early if you need to. No collateral needed on these loans. And there's no personal guarantee, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ramifications of applying for this loan and some of the language you're going to be agreeing to when you apply. So without much ado, let's get into looking at the actual presentation or the actual information here. And we will go to the application itself here. So this is the application that you would be filling out when you're working with your lender. So we're going to start right at the top, which is always a good place to start. And the first thing it's going to ask us is about who you are. So what's your company structure? And you're going to see here, they're going to name out all the different kinds of structures you might be familiar with: sole proprietor, partnership, C Corp, and so on. There is some fuzziness about eligible self-employed individual, independent contractor, and sole proprietor. So we're telling folks, if you're a sole proprietor that has employees, use the sole proprietor bucket. If you are just self-employed, you would use that tick mark. There are a couple categories of nonprofits that can apply for the PPP, and there is a limitation on this. So this is a question that's coming up a lot. Only the two that are those that are specified are able to apply. So 501c3 nonprofits, so charitable nonprofits, or 501c19 veterans organizations. We've had a lot of inquiries from chambers and other entities that are 501c6s at this time, not eligible for this program. So you want to make sure that you're indicating the correct category when you apply. The next couple fields are pretty straightforward: your business legal name, the address of your business. If you use a DBA or trade name, so that might be something you registered with your county clerk or county recorder. It might be something you registered with the Secretary of State, but there you would want to note your DBA or trade name. Your business tax identification number. So for some of you, that will be an EIN, an employer ID number. And for others, you may simply be using your Social Security number and have not gotten an EIN. Again, easy ones: business phone number, primary contact, and email address. So make sure, double check, make sure you give them really good information here for this contact. If there's any question or issue, you want to make sure that they're able to get a hold of you. This is a simple application. For a complex program, we have a very simple application. This next little section really gets into the meat of what everybody wants to know, which is how much money I can get. And they've made a note in here which makes it a little confusing. So I want to clarify this. There was an earlier version that looked a little different. The meaning is still the same, but they did add some additional language here. So in this program, the maximum you're allowed to borrow has to do with your payroll. So you're going to indicate here your average monthly payroll. That should be from the last 12 months. Now, you will find that if you're a seasonal business, there's going to be some alternate calculations that you would use to do that. So perhaps you're not normally in business for 12 months, which makes things confusing. In that case, I would ask you to reach out to the SBDC director in your area or talk with your banker. There are lots of calculators available out on the internet that are helping folks work through this calculation. But for most businesses that run year round, you're going to take your year prior and you're going to divide that by 12. You're going to multiply that by 2.5, and that's going to give you the amount of the loan, and you're going to indicate here how many employees. Now you're saying, well, what's this EIDL, net of advance? Well, there is a special opportunity that if you are borrowing to refinance a prior emergency loan, and I'm guessing there probably aren't many folks that fall into this boat in our immediate area, but some parts of the country could be under a disaster from last spring's flooding or any number of other things. If you are refinancing an economic injury disaster loan, you're going to add that into that amount in there. Additionally, if you received a cash advance, many people did apply for an EIDL loan within the last couple of weeks and may have asked for that cash advance. If you receive the cash advance, that does need to be removed from that loan amount. And again, I know we're getting into a lot of details here and it gets kind of complicated. So if you don't have a straightforward, clear-cut situation, again, ask questions of your banker, reach out to the SBDC, and we'll get those answers for you. So that's probably the most complicated part of this whole application, Patrick, is that this calculation for how do we figure out the payroll number and what goes in there. There is some language around what counts as payroll costs, and things include salary, wages, commissions, or tips. You can include benefits, so that could be vacation time, sick leave, again, not including sick leave that falls under this Families First Corona Response Act, state and local taxes on compensation. So there's a whole bunch of things that go into that bucket when we're calculating that average monthly payroll.
And Amy, as we're looking at that average, is that over the last 12 months, the last 6 months, the last year?
They're asking for a year. We're typically, they're typically making that calculation through a year, which is why when we get into that seasonal business, it makes it kind of weird because and if you were to average it over a year, your numbers wouldn't be right. So you'll use a seasonal calculator. The loan itself, excuse me, you're going to indicate the purpose, what you're going to use this for. And again, as I stated, you can only use this money for certain things: payroll, lease or mortgage interest, utilities. Rent is not listed there, but it is listed on the fact sheet from the SBA. So you want to indicate how you intend to use that loan. And throughout this document, I want to remind you that you're filling out a federal form that you're going to sign at the bottom. So, you know, double check, attention to detail, being sure that you really, truly are representing your situation when you're filling out this paperwork. The next section is really getting into who are the owners of the business. For many of our small businesses, you might have one or two owners, but you may be in a situation where you have a whole host of people. The only folks that need to be included here are people who own 20% or more of the equity of the business. So you'll see there's only two lines there. Let's assume that you do have 5 equal partners who all own 20%. You just need to attach a separate piece of paper that lists those folks out. And if they have either a TIN, which is their EIN, or their social security number, you want to include that as well. So again, anybody who's 20% or more of the equity does need to be included. Now we get into this next section, and these are all yes or no questions. Most of them are fairly straightforward, but again, read them understanding that you're signing a legal document and that you're attesting to this information. The first one wants to know if you have been suspended, debarred, or declared ineligible from participation by any federal department or agency, or if you're involved in any bankruptcy. So this answer should not be a surprise to you. You shouldn't be surprised by knowing that you've been debarred. I would hope that you would know your status with the federal government. So hopefully for 99% of us, the answer here is no, we're not debarred, we're not in a problem, but if you get to that one and it's a yes, the loan is gonna not be approved. The next question, has the owner, any owner of the business, ever obtained a direct or guaranteed loan from the SBA or other federal agency that is delinquent or has been defaulted in the last 7 years? And one of the surprises that sometimes folks run into on a question like this is federal student loans. So maybe you didn't have a business loan, but maybe you have a student loan you failed to pay. That would also preclude you from having an approved loan under this program. So again, shouldn't be a surprise to you, hopefully, but do remember that federal student loans do fall under that as well. And then number 3, is the applicant or any owner of this business an owner of another business or have common management? This is just, they're looking for full disclosure here. So you're going to add a piece of paper, another sheet, and explain those overlaps. So if I own a bar and grill, but I also own a managing interest in the hardware store down the road, we would want to disclose that here on this application. And then it's asking if you received an economic injury disaster loan between January and April 3rd of this year. So it would be unlikely because most people probably were not in the queue for that loan early enough to have met that deadline. But if you did, again, you would want to disclose that and then add an addendum explaining how much you received. Now these next couple, again, there's another couple disqualifying questions. So number 5 is asking if any owner, so again, anybody with 20% or more, is subject to an indictment, criminal information arraignment, or other means by which formal criminal charges are brought, or is on probation or parole. Being a federal program, the SBA does have some pretty strict rules about who they will lend money to. And in this case, you do have to mark yes or no and initial. So you're indicating that no, you're not in any of those circumstances, which is going to clear the way for the loan. And number 6, also one that will disqualify you. This is for felony conviction, guilty plea, and you can read through that yourself. But again, they're asking you to initial and mark yes or no. So if you weren't sure if they were serious, the initialing in addition to the yes or no, pretty good sign. So do know that you want to not be even hedging a little bit about truth on a form like this. Because the Payroll Protection Act or Paycheck Protection Program is geared to make sure that we're keeping paychecks going in the US, you'll see number 7 asks about the principal place of residence for all employees. So they want to make sure that those numbers you're using when you calculate your maximum loan amount are folks that live and work in the US. And then number 8, again, this one you should know the answer to. If you are a franchise, you probably know whether or not you're in the franchise directory. If you're unsure, it is online, or you can check with your lender and they should be able to answer that question. So really, this application is 1 page, pretty straightforward. Those are the questions. Now, is there more to it than this? Absolutely. But that's the application pretty much in a nutshell. Everything on page 2 is you basically certifying, swearing, asserting that these things are true. So I'm not going to read it verbatim. I do want to point out a couple things that the number of employees is either under 500 or you need to meet a particular exception within the SBA Small Business Code. I'm guessing most of our listeners probably fall into that under 500 bucket. They do indicate that all loan proceeds must be used for business-related purposes. And there is a note in there that says, to the extent feasible, I will purchase only American-made equipment products. So interesting thing that they've called out there. And then the last bullet in that bullet point here says that any loan received under the Small Business Act between January 31st and April 3rd was for a purpose other than paying payroll costs. And I call this last one out just as a note because that is to make sure that you're not double dipping, so that you're not using money, say, from an idle loan to pay payroll and then recouping it on the Payroll Protection Act. So those uses must be separate and non-duplicated between the 2 federal programs. This last section are all the things where you're certifying in good faith to these statements. You're going to initial each one. You're going to indicate that you were in operation on February 15th, that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. This one's broad. We don't know how that's going to be interpreted, but just make sure that you really need the loan, that this is a legitimate business need to keep your business operating. It talks a little bit about how you're going to use the funds. The 4th item there talks about the documentation you will provide to the bank for the 8-week period following the loan. Forgiveness is going to be for anything provided it fits into those buckets and not more than 25% of the amount may be non-payroll. Talks about the fact you can't have another loan. The last, next to the last one there is the big one. You want to make sure that you are not being fraudulent. As I said, this is a really simple application. And that's fantastic. But the flip side of that is that they are going to have their radar up for fraud. So be sure that you are truly in need of the money, deserving of the money, and not misrepresenting anything, because it does spell out there what those penalties are. And I don't think I'd like any of them. I don't know about you guys. And then finally, they acknowledge that the lender is going to confirm the loan amount by looking at the documents that are provided. Sign, print, date, and submit. And again, this is through your bank. All of the fields are explained here in these last couple pages, and everything pretty much from the Paperwork Reduction Act down is all legal disclosure information. So the information you need to fill out the form is there in the top part. So Patrick, I kind of went through that quick, but questions that you had as you listened to me go through that, any questions that have come from the audience?
Yeah, so for everyone that is watching, we are live right now, taking questions in Zoom or through Facebook. So if you've got those, we're talking with Amy Dutton from the SBDC on the PPP application. One, can we scroll back up to where we're calculating that payment? And let's just make sure that we're following along correctly. So if you have gotten an advance from EIDL, you subtract that from this request. So how would you go about calculating that?
Yeah, so it's a little confusing because they don't give you room here on the form to actually do all the math. So you're going to take your average monthly payroll. We're going to say our average monthly payroll is $10,000, and we're going to times it by 2.5. So we're at $25,000. And then if we were refinancing an EIDL, that would be an old loan, we would add that amount. We're going to assume we're not refinancing, but we did get a cash advance of $10,000. We would take that away, and in that second open box, we would put in $15,000. So unfortunately, it's not a case where you show your work like a normal tax form where you're putting every entry and it shows. Here, you're going to do some work on the backside that's not going to be reflected. I recommend that you still document that in some way. The lender is the one that is going to be taking care of all the details. So they will do a good job of that. But before you walk in the door to the bank, I recommend that you do this calculation and figure out what you need.
Awesome. And so then another question that came through in Zoom here, and it's I know one that we've talked about. If you're a single entity LLC, so proprietor with an LLC, most of those times, you know, the net earnings from them Schedule Cs are at or near zero, you know, because they don't either pay themselves or they take a draw. Are they eligible through PPP?
Unfortunately, the information we received last week from the SBA indicated that that is not eligible earnings at this time under this program. We continue, when I say we, the SBDC network nationally continues to have conversations with our legislators and with the entities in Washington to work on resolving that question. But right now, yeah, if you are a C Corp, or I'm sorry, an LLC, not treated as an S Corp, not treated as an S Corp for tax purposes, and all you're getting is that draw, that dollar amount cannot be used for this calculation. And that is probably the biggest challenge we've run into.
Gotcha. So we have another question here. So their store is shut down. If they get this loan, could they pay the staff to come back to work and complete activities without reopening the store?
Absolutely, yeah. And the flip side to that, so you could receive the loan. You could pay people to do duties that you can't do normally. In fact, at the university where Patrick and I normally have offices, they're doing maintenance projects and things that they normally wouldn't have time to do. You could do the same in your business. But the flip is also true. So if you are, say, a restaurant and you don't, or some other business that doesn't have work for folks to do, and you don't want to bring them back, applying now on this loan might be problematic because the bank has 10 days to get those funds out to you. And then the clock on that 8 weeks starts the minute the funds are distributed to you. So that is a challenge. And we don't.
That 8 weeks of, so what's the 8 weeks you're referencing then?
Yeah, the 8 weeks is the time during which you need to spend down this loan and track what you've spent it on for the forgivable portion of this money.
Gotcha. So then in that same scenario, do they have to bring back their whole staff or just a portion?
I want to say they have to bring back the whole staff. And again, this is where we get into, I'm not familiar with all of the details. You do have until June 30th to restore your full-time employment for any changes made between February 15th and April 26th. So if you filled out this form and in this number of employees, you showed that you had 10 people, but during this time you only have 8, well, the forgivable portion of your loan in that 8 weeks is going to be dictated by however many employees you have, and you have documentation for pay, but you can bring your staff back to 10 employees by June 30th. So they do give you that cushion of time to June 30th to bring everybody back up to full staff.
Gotcha. Is there any calculation that they're looking at for full-time employees versus part-timers, or is that hours based?
Not that I am aware of. It is purely being indicated that I am understanding by just payroll. It is not splitting out full-time versus part-time jobs in the documentation that I'm seeing from SBA.
Gotcha. One note here on the LLC question from our friend Amy Coolers, that if you are a sole prop or an LLC single owner, you should be able to apply for unemployment benefits even if they can't apply for PPP.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you to Amy, a good friend of our program, for pointing that out, because that is absolutely the truth. And we want to make sure that folks do apply for that and get in the queue for that help.
Absolutely. So other questions I'm looking at here. Thank you everybody for joining us this morning. We're talking about the PPP application walkthrough. We've got just a couple minutes left to try and go over a few more things. If you have questions, please enter them into the box. We may not be able to get to your questions, but we'll be able to follow up with you afterwards.
So I just pulled up the SBDC site. I don't know, Patrick,
Yep.
if you can see that.
Yep.
Because we know there are a lot of questions, this is why we're here. So if you're interested in reaching out to the counselor in your area, you can click this request counseling button, or you can look at the locations and see which office is closest to you or makes the most sense. And there's a request counseling button. Here's mine. And you can just hit that request counseling and it's going to send a message to me. I promise to look that happy when I talk to you and try to help you with this very complex project. But please reach out to us. There's no cost for our services, it's confidential, and that's what we're here for.
Absolutely. So one last question. It kind of goes back to, again, calculating that average monthly salary. Let's say if something was off last year, maybe you were doing a different project. The question we've got specifically talks about flipping a house, so they didn't pay themselves very much, but now starting at the beginning of this year, they did pick up some payroll expenses. How would they go about calculating that average monthly payroll?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure it's one I have an answer for. I think that could be a discussion with the lender. What we're finding is that the loans, when you make that request for that loan, as I said, the application form is real short, but that's not the end of the story. The bank is may ask for very specific documentation to back this up. We did hear about somebody who got a loan recently and it came back to them and they needed to provide a whole raft of information. So if they're trying to justify that inquiry, it's going to be up to the bank what kind of documentation they want you to provide. I'm not confident they'd be able to put in a request for more than what you made the prior year.
Gotcha. So not even being able to look forward or what you just started doing?
No, and unfortunately, we've had a number of those circumstances. I won't disclose a lot of detail here, but did have a client who, started their business middle of last year, and the numbers aren't great and aren't there. So it makes it a little tricky. But again, I would encourage you to have a discussion with your bank. The banks are the ones that are making the initial justification, and then they're getting confirmation from the SBA. So start with your banker, have that dialogue. We'll do our best to get answers. The SBDC is a separate entity from the SBA. We get some funding from them. But we are fortunate to have great relationships and communication and are trying to get those answers for all these weird, unique situations that are coming up as we encounter them.
Absolutely. Well, we're just about out of time here today, Amy. So any final thoughts? I was going to ask you about addendums, but we'll leave that to a different time. Addendums.
Yeah, and I think most of them are fairly straightforward. I would encourage you, again, have a conversation with your bank. Recognize and be patient with your banks. This is a program that was rolled out extremely quickly. Banks are still figuring out. The SBA is still figuring out some of the fine points as questions come up. So patience as you deal with them, but it's in their best interest to help you, and they want to. It's just that we're all trying to figure it out as we go on.
Absolutely. So keep in mind, this session is recorded. So if you're watching this at a later date, we recorded this on April 14th. So our information is current as we know it, or to the best of our ability as of the 14th of April. And things could be subject to change with this or any other program that we mentioned. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning for our latest webinar in our Coping with COVID-19 Creative Solutions for Your Business webinar series. Our staff at both the SBDC at UNI and the Center for Business Growth and Innovation in Advance, Iowa, are still working, albeit from our basements and homes. We're here to support you, answer your questions as you're working through these different applications, questions, funding programs, and other support. So please feel free to reach out. This is recorded. It'll be available on advanceiowa.com, where we've got our full schedule of webinars. We're trying to do at least one a day live on a topic that is important to our businesses. So we appreciate you either watching live or watching this recorded on YouTube, CBGI's website, and Advance Iowa. So thank you, Amy, again for the time this morning. We very much appreciated you walking us through that, and we hope to see everybody in the next webinar.
Sounds good.